Hello, and welcome to Western Civ, episode 276, The Coming of the Inquisition. The expulsion of 1492 didn't solve any problems. In fact, it only aggravated an old one. The small ex-Jewish community was now added to the already large community of converted Jews. A quote-unquote converso danger, which till then might have been an exaggerated project of the clerical imagination, now took on serious proportions. Many Jews stayed and retained their property, but they were not always favorably accepted in communities where anti-Semitism had been stirred up. Immigrants had been allowed to transfer their property to new Christians, so that assets often continued to remain in the same family. In post-1492 Christian society, the new conversos occupied exactly the same social position as the Jews. As before the expulsion, they continued to be occupied as traders, tax gatherers, moneylenders, farmers, tailors, and cobblers. The populace found it easy enough to identify the new Christians with the old Jews, both socially and religiously. The process, of course, was helped by the conservative habits of the conversos, the survival of Jewish practices, and the difficulty many converts found in adapting themselves to Christian usage. The ex-Jews had to merge into an already existing converso society, with which they didn't, on the main, have a lot in common. There were tens of thousands of conversos, most of them dating all the way back to 1391, and these folks had played an active role in Christian Spain for over a century. At the upper social level, post-1391 conversos played a significant role in towns, the basic political unit in Spain. Towns were the focal point of rural communities and also the key to royal authority. Many successful Jewish families, by changing their religion, became qualified to hold public office for the first time ever in these towns. The result was only a growth of rivalry between newcomers and older oligarchs, and I mean both older conversos and just old Christians. In some Castilian cities, such as Burgos and Toledo, conversos were influential on the town council. In others, they used their tenure of public office to band together, contributing to the bitter and sometimes bloody rivalry that characterized Castilian political life in the late 15th century. The converso historian Diego de Valera reports that in Cordoba on the city council, quote, there was great enmity and rivalry, since the new Christians were very rich and kept buying public offices, which they made use of so arrogantly that the old Christians would not put up with it, end quote. In Ceuta, according to a different chronicler, the conversos, quote, shamelessly took over all the public posts and discharged them with extreme contempt of the nobility and with grave harm to the state, end quote. Continuing, in the city of Palencia in 1465, quote, there were great factions of old Christians and conversos, with the principal families of the city supporting the conversos, end quote. The political role of conversos was evidently limited only to towns where Jews had been numerous, but in those few towns, it was a significant number. In Cuenca, converso families in the late 15th century occupied 85% of the posts on the city council. In Guadalajara, they also had a similar advantage. Conversions became significant from the end of the 14th century, were substantial, and during the 15th. Converts from the Jewish elite had the advantage of being accepted on equal terms into the Christian elite. In other words, all the expulsion of 1492 did was get rid of some Jews and turn others into desperate rivals of existing power structures. Conversos played a very important role in the early years of the Inquisition, as they did throughout the Spanish government. At the end of the 15th century, all of the major administrators of the Kingdom of Aragon were conversos. At the moment that the Inquisition was born, 5 conversos held the most important posts in the kingdom. Conversos played an essential role in the court of Isabella and Ferdinand. In Castile, during the reign of Isabella, at least 4 bishops were conversos. conversos also excelled in finance. Two such conversos financiers, Luis de Sant-Angel and Gabriel Sanchez, were the ones who financed Columbus's first expedition to the New World. It had also been argued that Columbus himself descended from a family of conversos, though historians still hotly debate that assertion. The other notable occupation for the conversos remained medicine. You will note, of course, from the previous episode that these fields are similar fields I told you that the Jews also excelled in. Becoming a converso for a Jewish financier or doctor was a way to continue your occupation, but open a few more doors. The Spanish monarchs regularly employed converso doctors. Both King Ferdinand and then Charles V had the same converso physician. And interestingly, there was a long tradition, even by the start of the 16th century, of converso families committing their sons and daughters to a life in the church. Many were brought up within the religious orders. Others went on to secure important benefices that then did not go to older Christian families. By the mid-16th century, it was maliciously reported that most of the Spanish clergy in Rome were conversos. Conversos were also prominent intellectuals. A handful of upper-class Jewish converts made, by their writing, a contribution to the intellectual life out of proportion to their numbers. Though there was, generally, peaceful coexistence between old Christians and Jews during the 15th century, in some towns, the imposition of powerful converso families made for immediate conflict with old Christians. In an effort to help the situation somewhat, Pope Nicholas, in September of 1449, issued a papal bull denouncing the idea of excluding Christians from office simply because of their lineage. He wrote, quote, "We decree and declare that all Catholics are one body in Christ, according to the teaching of our faith," end quote. Sadly, the Pope's decree had little impact on the reality on the ground. And the reality remained that there were very few conversos who had been coerced into their conversion, who, in reality, embraced Catholicism sincerely. Yet, the contrary reality is also true, and that is that over time, these converts settled into their new religion with few problems. For example, when violence broke out in 1391, not a single Christian writer had doubted that the new Christians were anything but genuine. The violence was exclusively directed towards the Jews. None suggested that the conversos should be the target of the rioting. But by the middle of the 15th century, things had started to change. By 1473, there was major anti-converso rioting in Cordoba. One notable converso casualty was the Constable of Castile, who was cut down that year standing at the high altar of the cathedral as he attempted to defend the conversos. It was the events of the 1470s, not the perception of any heresy, that brought the Inquisition into existence. Generally, this happened in the southern tip of the Iberian Peninsula, where the coexistence of the three faiths acted as a sufficient powder keg. The ambiguous religion of the conversos raised a crucial question. Were the conversos Christians, or were they Jews? The issue was first broached seriously after the mass conversions of 1391. Those who remained in their Jewish faith wanted to know how to exist with the converts. In the 15th century, long before the Great Expulsion, the rabbis in North Africa were repeatedly asked for their judgments on the matter. Their opinions were unequivocal. The conversos must be regarded not as unwilling converts, but as real and voluntary converts. There was ample evidence to back up the judgments. In many parts of Spain, the conversos continued living in some measure as Jews, but with the advantage now of enjoying rights according to Christians. In Majorca, a rabbi commented, "The authorities, quote, are lenient with the conversos and allow them to do as they will," end quote. The conversos here were virtually practicing Jews from the Christian point of view, but enjoying official tolerance they remained Christians. And it was their voluntary Christianity which marked them out in Jewish eyes as renegades, as real and voluntary converts. The spate of conversions throughout Spain during the 15th century intensified the controversy. Easygoing Jews who converted for convenience became, naturally, of course, easygoing when it came to practicing their Christianity. In an anti-Jewish polemic of the 1480s, the author described the conversos as being neither practicing Jews nor practicing Christians. In today's parlance, we would probably call these folks agnostic. Being neither one thing nor the other, they were known as, in some places, abriacos, after the fabled animal of Muhammad, which was neither horse nor mule. Anti-Semitic writers at the time of the Inquisition were, for their part, unanimous that the conversos were all secret Jews and must be purified ruthlessly. Many modern writers, in no way anti-Semitic, have consistently identified the conversos as Jews. Yet the opinion changes dramatically when we look at the Jewish population of Spain. Amongst contemporary Jews, there was no question that the conversos were separate. Jews and conversos might come together for family events, but generally they belonged to different social circles. Conversos, as you might expect, insisted in every record that we have that they were genuinely Christian. Now, later conversos, late 15th century on, were more realistic. They were willing to admit the existence of religious confusion. And the cause of that confusion is obvious, at least if we're looking at image. You know, what you would see if you walked down the streets in one of these towns. Because physically, the conversos still lived in the same part of town as before their conversion, side by side with practicing Jews. This was again before the Great Expulsion. They also retained their same traditional characteristics in dress and food. And no doubt within some converso households, there remained sincere, practicing Jews. Those among the old Christians who criticized the conversos were predominantly their enemies. From the anti-Jewish propaganda of the 1440s to the polemics of a half a century later, their anti-converso theme was constant. All conversos went the refrain, are secret Jews. All of them are a threat to our society and to our religion, Christianity. It was alleged that they continued to practice the Jewish rites both secretly and openly, presenting the authorities with a large minority of pseudo-Christians who had neither respect nor love for their new faith. At the end of the day, the question that gets asked most often was there in reality a quote-unquote converso danger? Were thousands of converso Christians all over Spain secretly observing Jewish practices? Historians today doubt very much that that was the case. Now, writing several years later, when so much blood had been spilt that it would have been intolerable to deny the justice of what had happened, the anti-Jewish chronicler Bernaldez declared unhesitatingly that the conversos were secret heretics. Throughout the provinces of the south, according to him, of all the conversos, quote, hardly any are true Christians, as is well known in all of Spain, end quote. Now, one of the big problems here, of course, was that the accusers often didn't know the tenets of Judaism. So how do you declare that someone's a secret practicing Jew if you don't know what that is? The basic ignorance of Jewish law meant that most people were accused of offenses which were more cultural than religious. For example, when a woman was condemned as a heretic in 1484 for admitting that she observed Saturday as a day of rest, there is no evidence whatsoever that she was a practicing Jew. Perhaps she just liked more than one day of rest per week. Don't we all? Frankly, as of the late 1470s, despite repeated blanket accusations, there was little evidence, or really any evidence, of Jewish proselytizing. Nor, for that matter, is there any evidence why such a movement should arise in the climate of late 15th century Spain. Yet those who influenced crown policy remained convinced Jews were widely trying to convert Christians to their religion, despite the total lack of evidence. This converso danger, as it was called, was invented out of whole cloth to justify the condemnation of the conversos and their subsequent persecution. For their part, conversos never ceased to protest that false witnesses and greed were the driving forces behind the Inquisition. Now, frankly, if you want my opinion for what it's worth, I think when we look at this, the most plausible view of the matter is that most conversos probably were outwardly practicing Christians, but there's no doubt that certainly some were very sympathetic to Judaism. A factor that undoubtedly contributed to the tensions over and above anti-Semitism and converso feeling was the converso's own sense of a separate identity. Already a powerful minority by the mid-15th century, conversos were secure of their social position and proud to be both Christian and of Jewish descent. They did not, as is sometimes thought, attempt to disguise their origins. They were, as many of their own writers affirmed clearly, a nation. They had their own identity, and they took pride in it. The same writer from before, Bernaldez, reported that, quote, they entertained the arrogant claim that there was no better people in the world than they, end quote. Other writers reported complaints by old Christians that the conversos acted, quote, as a nation apart, and nowhere would they agree to act together with the old Christians. Indeed, as though they were a people of totally opposed ideas, they openly and brazenly favored whatever was contrary to the old Christians, as could be seen in the bitter fruit sown throughout the cities of the realm, end quote. Implicit in the conservo attitude was the claim that they were even better than old Christians, because together with the Christian faith, they combined direct descent from the lineage of Christ. It was said that Alonso de Cartagena, when he recited the Hail Mary, used to end with the words, quote, Holy Mary, Mother of God, and my blood relative, pray for us, end quote. Converso nobles considered themselves to be even better than old Christian nobles, because they were of Jewish origin. Of course, converso separateness had a certain logic to it. The mass conversions following 1391 left many people who simply could not be easily fitted into existing social structures. In the 1390s, in both Barcelona and Valencia, new converts were given their own churches. And in each case, this new church was a former synagogue. Unfortunately, this converso self-defensiveness directed towards old Christians likely contributed to the wall of distrust between these new and these old Christians. The Inquisition was not unknown in Spain when it was revived in the late 15th century. In 1232, papal commissions for inquisitors had been issued by the Crown of Aragon as a part of campaign against the heretical Cathars that had been conducted at the time in Languedoc. Yet by the year 1400, the papal Inquisition in Aragon had virtually disappeared. What brought it back was the converso question. Well before the reigns of Ferdinand and Isabella, Spanish clergy were demanding a new Inquisition to investigate the depth of converso Christian conviction. The discovery and immediate burning of 2 conversos in September 1467 for practicing Judaism seemed to confirm the religious insincerity of all new Christians. Preachers made the most of these sorts of cases. Among them was a gentleman by the name of Alonso de Ojeda, a Dominican prior of Seville, who devoted seemingly all of his energies to making the crown aware of the reality of danger from Jews and false converts. In 1474, Queen Isabella succeeded her brother Henry on the throne. Hoida's opportunity came when the queen visited Seville in July of 1477 and stayed until October 1478. Historians unanimously cite Hoida's preaching as one of the immediate influences on the queen in her final decision about the conversos. Soon after Isabella's departure from Seville, Hoida claimed to have uncovered evidence of a secret meeting of those proselytizing Judaism, conversos that is, in the city. With this in his hand, he went to demand the institution of measures against the heretics. The converso problem, when brought to the queen's attention during her stay in Seville, may at the time have seemed like a small matter of detail in the midst of other commitments. Remember, we're still in the middle of the Reconquista. The request for an inquisition was likewise not unusual at all. Royal officials had for some time now been authorized to make general inquisitions into crimes and offenses. And it was part of the pacification policy to make inquisitions into the activities of known or unknown delinquents. When the crown sanctioned an inquisition into the activities of alleged Jewish proselytizers, it was more or less simply routine. Yet in this case, it soon turned into something much more serious, because it implicated converso urban elites who up until then had supported the crown unequivocally. According to Hoida and others, the converso problem was so grave that only the introduction of a full-time inquisition would be adequate. Consequently, the bull, which was finally issued by Pope Sixtus IV on the 1st of November 1478, provided for the appointment of 2 or 3 priests over 40 years of age as permanent inquisitors. Powers of appointment and dismissal were granted to the Spanish crown. After this, no further steps were taken for about 2 years. This long interlude would seem to contradict Hoida's argument about the urgency of the converso problem. What seems like a likely explanation for the delay is that the crown favored a policy of leniency before going on to severe measures, and that this policy may have been influenced in part by the large number of conversos in prominent positions at court. Finally, Ferdinand grew convinced of the need. As he explained several years later, quote, "We could do no less, because we were told so many things about Andalusia," end quote. On the 27th of September, 1480, at Medina del Campo, commissions as inquisitors, in accordance with the papal bull, were issued to several Dominicans, including Juan de San Martin and Miguel de Morillo, with Juan Ruiz de Medina as their assistant. And so, with these appointments, in September 1480, the Spanish Inquisition came into existence. Most historians then debate this question. On what evidence did the tribunal justify its existence? Was there cause for the Inquisition? Historians have tended to accept without question the reason given by the Inquisition, namely, that they were worried about conversos trying to convert people to Judaism. The fact is that apart from a handful of scattered cases, there was no systematic evidence of such efforts. New Christian writers in the mid-century had firmly denied these accusations. Zealots opposing them could only point to unsubstantiated rumors and allegations of the flimsiest evidence. Nowhere in Spain, outside of a handful of cities in the south where political riots had taken place, was there pressure for an inquiry. Indeed, if the Inquisition claimed to have religious motives, those motives were difficult to justify by the evidence. So what did the monarchs hope to gain by the foundation of the Inquisition? There's much to be said for the argument that the crown, in the person above all of Ferdinand, who was the guiding force in its establishment and who continued the efforts after the death of Isabella, wished to use it to consolidate his power. Further definition of Ferdinand's intentions is, though, quite difficult, and will probably forever be the subject of dispute. We're just not sure about how pure his religious motives were. He and Isabella may have been zealous Catholics, but as we've seen, they were by no means anti-Jewish or anti-converso. We might also doubt whether Ferdinand thought that the work of the Inquisition would add to his income. Nor, honestly, is it even true, nor, I suppose, can we document that Ferdinand was hoping to consolidate his power by directing opposition against the converso elite in Spain. Honestly, we can't even say, was there a long-term strategy here? We're not sure. Was it supposed to be purely local and temporary? Maybe. Neither the crown nor the early supporters of the Inquisition looked, at least circa 1480, much further than the frontiers of the south and Andalusia. The immediate purpose was to ensure religious orthodoxy. For the first 5 years of its existence, the Tribunal of Castile limited its activities to the south, particularly in the regions of Seville and Cordoba. It was the area where social conflicts of the preceding century had concentrated. There was, at least initially, no thought of a nationwide inquisition. By mid-October 1480, operations had begun in Seville. In Andalusia, as in the rest of Castile, there had been years of political conflict. The appearance of the inquisitors was made possible because of Isabella's supporters in the Civil War imposed their authority on the local elite. The opposition, many of them conversos and supporters of rebel nobles, were simply pushed out. On the main with the Inquisition, I think oftentimes we simply have to shrug our shoulders because oftentimes we simply have more questions than we have answers. We're still in very early modern history here, so these gaps in our understanding are going to continue to persist for some time. Now, turning back to the Inquisition here, the first act of faith by this revived Spanish Inquisition was celebrated on the 6th of January, 1481, when 6 people were burnt at the stake. Now, I'm going to use the term act of faith, or as it's commonly called in the sources, an auto de fe, as a lot, so let me define it. An act of faith, when we're talking about the Inquisition, is a public ceremony during which the sentences upon those brought before the Spanish Inquisition were read aloud, and after which the sentences were executed by the secular authorities. So it's the last stage in a proceeding that's brought by the Inquisition. It was considered a celebration, which seems morbid, I suppose, but it was, from their perspective at least. It was not long after when several members of the Spanish clergy began to feel like their operations needed to be massively enlarged. In other words, almost instantaneously, they felt like they needed more inquisitors. A papal brief was filed several days later, and more inquisitors were appointed. One of them, who I'll talk about much more in later episodes, would go on to be one of the most infamous men of the Inquisition's history, Tomás de Torquemada. He was a Dominican friar whose zeal for burning conversos as heretics was nearly without limit. By 1492, there were Inquisition tribunals in Cordoba, Toledo, and Valladolid, amongst other smaller towns. Not all of these had a permanent existence, and it's worth noting that the Inquisition was always more active in the south compared to the north. But the real question facing the Inquisition in those early years of revival was who was in charge. Was the Inquisition under secular or Catholic authority? Who was in command, the Pope or the Spanish monarch? In 1482, Pope Sixtus, responding to allegations of abuse directed toward the inquisitors of Seville, revoked the Inquisition, unless it was that it agreed to be subject to the local bishop. The Pope probably thought that was the end of the matter. The Spanish crown disagreed. As part of his consolidation policy, Ferdinand took steps in 1481 and 1482 to assert royal control over the appointment and payment of inquisitors in Aragon. Essentially, he wanted to resurrect the old Inquisition, but place it firmly under his control. The first activities of this reformed tribunal, with its main centers in the cities of Barcelona, Saragossa, and Valencia, were directed against, you guessed it, the conversos, who took alarm at the developments and prepared for a mass emigration. But differences with the Pope, no doubt supplemented by pressure on Rome from the conversos, brought the activities of the Inquisition to a temporary stop. On the 18th of April, 1482, Pope Sixtus IV issued what historian Charles Lay calls, quote, the most extraordinary bull in the history of the Inquisition, end quote. In this bull, the Pope protested, quote, that in Aragon, Valencia, Majorca, and Catalonia, the Inquisition has for some time been moved not by zeal for faith and the salvation of souls, but by the lust for wealth, and that many true and faithful Christians, on the testimony of enemies, rivals, slaves, and other lower and even less proper persons, have without any legitimate proof been thrust into secular prisons, tortured and condemned as relapsed heretics, deprived of their goods and property, and handed over to the secular arm to be executed to the peril of souls, setting a pernicious example and causing disgust to many, end quote. Thus, in the future, all episcopal officers should act with the inquisitors. The names and testimony of the accused should be given to the accused, who must be given counsel. Episcopal jails should be the only ones used, and appeals must be allowed to Rome. The bull was extraordinary because, really, for the first time in history, heresy was declared to be like any other crime, and people would be entitled to fair trials and simple justice. Now, you'd think that this might sit well with everyone in Spain, but Ferdinand was outraged by papal action and pretended to disbelieve the authenticity of the bull on the grounds that no sensible pope would have issued such a document. On May 13, 1482, he wrote back, quote, things have been told me, Holy Father, which, if true, would seem to merit the greatest astonishment. It is said that your holiness has granted the conversos a general pardon for all the errors and offenses they have committed. To these rumors, however, we were given no credence because they seem to be things which would never be conceded by your holiness, who have a duty to the Inquisition. But if by chance these concessions have been made through the persistent and cunning persuasion of said conversos, I intend never to let them take effect. Take care, therefore, not to let the matter go further, and to revoke any concessions and entrust me with the care of this question. End quote. Before this resolution arrived, Pope Sixtus wavered, and in October announced that he had suspended the bull. The way lay completely open now to Ferdinand. Papal cooperation was definitively secured by another bill on the 17th of October, 1483, which appointed Torquemada as the Inquisitor General of Aragon, Valencia, and Catalonia, thus uniting the Inquisitions of the Spanish crown under a single authority. The new tribunal, then, came directly under the control of the crown and was the only institution whose authorities ran in all the territories of Spain. Aragon continued to bitterly resist the imposition of a Castilian Inquisition. The kingdoms had been merged under the marriage of the Catholic monarchs, but politically they remained very separate. In Aragon, the king was supposed to rule in coordination with the local cortes. These were what had briefly revolted when I was talking about Charles V many moons ago. Now, as then, they threatened civil war, lest the Spanish king at least agree to consult with them on this issue. When public opposition grew so great that there was a move to summon the 4 great estates of the realm, Ferdinand hastily sent a letter around to the chief nobles and deputies, justifying his position. Quote, there is no intention of infringing on the fueros laws, but rather of enforcing their observance. It is not to be imagined that the vassals so Catholic as those of Aragon would have demanded, or that the kings so Catholic would have granted, fueros and liberties adverse to the faith and favorable to heresy. If the old inquisitors had acted conscientiously in accordance with the canons, there would have been no cause for bringing in the new ones, but they were without conscience and corrupted with bribes. If there are so few heretics, as is now asserted, there should not be such dread of the Inquisition. It is not to be impeded in sequestering and confiscating and other necessary acts, for be assured that no cause or interest, however great, shall be allowed to interfere with its proceedings in the future, as it is now doing, end quote. Yet, whatever the motives, whether personal dread or constitutional opposition, resistance continued. For example, when the tribunal of Saragossa sent 2 inquisitors to the city to establish itself, the city magistrates refused to grant them entrance. However, eventually they got in, and so the conversos started to leave in droves. In Barcelona, the same thing happened, and so the magistrates wrote a desperate letter to Ferdinand, begging him to stop the Inquisition. So many wealthy conservos were leaving the city, they said, to escape persecution, that the town fathers believed that the city's economy might well collapse. Their protests were in vain. But converso opposition to the Inquisition had by no means been destroyed. In fact, it grew more determined and more desperate. There were some conversos, and to be fair, old Christians as well, who decided that assassination was their best and only option. They would murder the lead inquisitor. On the night of September 16, 1485, in the city of Saragossa, they put their plan into action. That night, as the lead inquisitor knelt in prayer in the cathedral, several assassins crept up behind him. The man had been warned, so he wore chainmail underneath his cloak. It didn't save him. An assassin drove a sword straight through the man's back and neck. He died 24 hours later. But as you might have guessed, a move as drastic as this backfired. Once the general population learned that conversos were behind the assassination, the mood turned decisively against them. Within minutes, their fates were sealed. The population turned against the conversos, and while in much of Spain, the people still did not support the Inquisition, nor now were they willing to defend the conversos. For Ferdinand, the rise of the Inquisition came on the heels of his attempt to gain political control after the end of various civil wars that culminated in his marriage to Isabella. For him, the Inquisition would be a tool to assert royal control. It would be realpolitik, nothing less, nothing more. He never tried to use the Inquisition to destroy the conversos. This wasn't about religion for him. This was about control. He had converso support since the beginning of his reign, so he saw no reason to rock the boat. Accusations were occasionally made against conversos in the royal administration, but Ferdinand always protected them fiercely. Throughout his reign, Ferdinand made sure high-ranking conversos were exempt from the Inquisition's jurisdiction. The Spanish Inquisition was well established throughout Spain before the expulsion order in 1492. Though the order was not directed at them, many conversos fled with those Jews seeking exile, running from the Inquisition rather than a royal decree. Ironically, we have records proving, insofar as we can, that most of these families remained ardent Catholics abroad. The figures, however, indicate that they were right to run. Between 1488 and 1505, 99.3% of those tried by the Inquisition in Barcelona were conversos. In Valencia, between 1484 and 1530, that percentage was 91.6%. It was quite clear early on who the target of the Inquisition was. Evidently, the tribunal was not concerned with heresy in general, just converso heresy. Now, the way that inquisitors got people to confess, so now we're going to start to turn to get into the procedure here, which we'll get much more into the next few episodes, is called an Edict of Grace. The Edict of Grace was essentially a medieval pardon. The inquisitors would preach a sermon, recite a list of heresies, and then invite those forward who wished to confess or denounce someone else if they wanted. If you came forward within the period of grace, usually 30 to 40 days, then you would be absolved and reconciled to the church. There would still be a penalty, but it would not be as harsh as if one did not come forward. More than anything, this convinced people to come forward and simultaneously convinced the inquisitors that there was a real heresy problem, when the vast majority of these confessions were probably false positives. Now, some people didn't do this. Some people fled, always trying to stay one town ahead of the inquisitors. But the vast majority of people confessed and put themselves into the hands of the Inquisition. Between fear and humiliation, many conversos lived in constant dread. Punishments brought with them secular as well as religious penalties. But if you confessed during the Edict of Grace, you could usually just buy your way out. You know, just like Jesus would have wanted. The biggest advantage to confessing was that your goods and property would not be confiscated. Of course, as I mentioned, these Edicts of Grace also served to just pump up the numbers. Certainly, thousands of people found themselves before the Inquisition between the late 15th and early 16th century. The tribunal in Toledo alone handled 8,000 cases between 1481 and 1530, and this was when the total population of Spain was only around 6 million. The overwhelming number of these cases came as the result of the Edicts of Grace and subsequent confessions. Trial cases were far fewer. Now again, I want to point out the Inquisition was not equally active throughout Spain. It was much more active in Castile than in Aragon. The incidence of executions were also much higher in Castile than in Aragon. At Valladolid, on January the 5th, 1492, 32 people were burnt alive. Now, certainly, for reasons I'm going to discuss in a later episode, the final death toll from the Inquisition is likely far lower than historians once believed, but the overall impact was devastating. Oddly enough, one consequence of the Inquisition was a rebirth of Judaism. Conversos simply reverted back to the faith of their ancestors. I understand why. If you're going to be prosecuted for not being a real Christian almost no matter what you do, then what was the point of converting? Also, ironically, the persecution and subsequent flight of the conversos was far more damaging to the economy of Spain than the initial expulsion of the Jews in 1492. The founding of the Inquisition has often been cited as evidence that the Catholic monarchs of Spain desired to impose more uniformity of religion. The expulsion of the Jews seemed to confirm that idea. The monarchs, as fervent Catholics, certainly wished the nation to be united in faith. But still, there is no evidence at all of a deliberate policy to impose uniformity. Throughout the first decade of the Inquisition's career, Ferdinand and Isabella did not cease to protect their Jews, while simultaneously trying to eliminate proselytizing among the conversos. Even after the expulsion of the Jews, different Jewish groups enjoyed full freedom of religion in Castile for another decade, in Aragon for another 30 years. The ruthless drive against heresy, far from aiming at unification, was no more than a culmination of a long period of social and political pressure directed against not the Jews, but the conversos. Again, and I must point this out, the Inquisition was not a result of a Jewish problem. It was as a result of the converso problem that was inherently not religious in nature, but social and to a lesser degree, political. And I must stress, there was no justifiable reason for the Inquisition, especially before 1492. There simply was no evidence of hordes of secret Jews hiding among the conversos. But then, in 1492, the situation did change somewhat. The forced conversions and expulsions created the problem that the Inquisition then had to solve. This was especially the case amongst the conversos who initially went into exile and then returned for financial reasons. By and large, these people had no intention of actually converting. Why would they? According to one returnee in 1494, 2 years after the expulsion, he accepted baptism not for a love of Christ, but because he was owed a lot of money in Spain and needed to come back. After 1492, the inquisitors could count on the assistance of conversos to rat out these quote-unquote secret Jews, creating the perfect breeding ground for hysteria. As we will see next time, it did not take long for this to spin out of control. As always, if you'd like additional content or to support the show, check out the links in the show notes. We've got free trials of Western Civ 2.0. We also have free trial of the Patreon page, and every dollar there that you spend, even if it's $1 a month, $12 a year, is greatly appreciated because books, well, you still have to pay for them.